This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community, working in legislative, regulatory, and political arenas to promote the free enterprise system. Information at vachamber.com. Virginia hospitals and health systems provide jobs. They support our economy and promote public health. Local hospitals are always open to help people with unexpected health needs. Having a stable healthcare network is vital. Virginia hospitals are our lifeline.
I just received a letter from a student who thanked me for instilling the love of math in him. That's why I teach.
Brought to you by the Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.
Welcome to This Week in Richmond, and welcome to two guests that we've had on before, but it's been a while, if ever, they had the two of you on together. Quentin Kidd, Jeff Schapiro. Jeff with the Richmond Times-Dispatch, seen in print, on Twitter, on video, heard on the radio. Quentin Kidd, Vice Provost of Christopher Newport, Director of the Watson Center, and on Twitter, and all kinds of information. And we'll tell our viewers we're having this conversation here toward the end of October. They'll be seeing this show between now and the 3rd of November. So this will be the last show of This Week in Richmond before the election.
So our predictions better be right.
So it will be a real good test on that. But let me just start with a general issue about how to get your comments about just how divided the nation is right now in this election, and then segue into Virginia, and how divided are we in Virginia?
Well, we are as divided a nation as we've been politically probably since the Civil Rights era, I would think. But the divide is interesting. It's really a three-way divide. You've got on the right, you've got a quarter to a third of the population that feels very strongly about some social issues, abortion, things like that. Feels like their issues have been ignored or not. The Republican Party hasn't really performed on those issues as well as they'd promised. You have a small group on the left that feels economically frustrated. That group tends to be a little bit younger, so it doesn't have the history of issue sets that it's bothered by. And then you've got this larger third that is frustrated generally that the system isn't working. And they're not necessarily very Republican or very Democratic. They may lean one way or the other in any given election, but they're just frustrated at the inability of Washington to accomplish things, to do things, pass legislation, and make life better.
And that we see these approximations in Virginia is significant because for such a long period in Virginia's political history, it was sort of apart from the nation. It tended to stand to the right, on the edge, often on social issues, most notably race relations. But as the state has grown, as the population has diversified, as the majority of Virginians are coming here from elsewhere. I mean, this is a state in which the majority of people who live here are not from here. Virginia has become more of a mirror of the nation.
So what's going to happen then in Virginia on the elections? And when you get on a roll on that, with the two of you talking, not just presidential, but congressional races, open congressional seats, how do you see Virginia shaping out. When you think about those three different segments that make up the Commonwealth, and also talk with us some about how this may be geographic, those divides.
Well, there's certainly a geographic dimension to this. The vote trove in the eastern part of the state, which is also the state's economic engine, extending from the northern Virginia suburbs down Interstate 95, scooping up the Richmond area, and then swinging east along Interstate 64 to the seacoast. That's where the votes are. That's where the money is. That's where the power, economic and political, is. Everything pretty much west and south of Interstates 95 and 64, the countryside, once an area where it was still possible to run into Democrats, has now become solidly, if not reflexively, Republican. There are Democrats in some of the local offices, but for the most part, voters in those regions are voting Republican for statewide office, for the General Assembly, the House and the Senate, but less so for some of the local offices. Those elections tend very much to be friends and neighbors affairs. But in that eastern crescent, that's where the competition is, and that's where the diversification is most evident, and that's where the Republicans are having the most difficulty getting traction. If one believes that there is an element of fate that accompanies demographic change, those changes would seem to augur some promise for Democrats, but that promise would be concentrated in that eastern crescent of Virginia.
I think what's fascinating for me about this election is going to be Northern Virginia has had a growing influence in statewide elections for 2 decades, 2.5 decades. But this is the first election where it looks like one segment of voters in Northern Virginia are going to have an oversized influence, and that would be suburban women, suburban Fairfax, suburban Prince William, suburban Loudoun counties, 3 counties that are on average higher educated populations, higher income populations. It looks like women in those 3 counties in particular have so rejected Donald Trump and so embraced Hillary Clinton that they're driving, and this is happening nationally, by the way. This isn't just unique to Virginia. This is mirroring what's happening nationally. But they're so driving Hillary Clinton's numbers in Virginia right now that she very well could have a double-digit win on the outside. Not likely, but it's possible. But she's likely to have somewhere between a 5 and 8% win in Virginia. And it would be driven by those suburban women. And there are lots of them in those 3 counties in Northern Virginia, but they're all over Hanover County, Henrico County, parts of Chesterfield, all over York County, Suffolk, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, in Hampton Roads. They're driving Hillary Clinton's numbers in a way that they didn't drive Barack Obama's numbers in Virginia. Barack Obama's numbers were driven by younger voters and ethnic minority voters. Hillary Clinton's numbers in Virginia are being driven by a voting bloc that hasn't expressed itself as unified as it is this year, as far as I know, in Virginia's history.
You know, if there's one viewer out there who is saying, who is this university professor who knows all of this, then certainly they need to connect you with the Wasson Center and the reports and the weekly tracking that you're doing. And it seems like the last one I saw, you had the numbers almost 2 to 1 among likely women voters in the Commonwealth as far as their pick for the president.
Hillary Clinton is leading Barack Obama in white women, white college-educated women, by about 2 to 1.
You said Obama. You mean?
I'm
Trump.
sorry, Hillary Clinton. White college-educated women, and white college-educated voters, simply, including men and women, are favoring Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump by about 6 points right now in Virginia. Nationally, that voter, white college-educated voters, have not voted Democratic since 1956. So even in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater won the white college-educated vote. This may be the first election since 1956 where the white college-educated vote goes to the Democrat, and that's being driven by that white college-educated woman. That's really where those numbers are coming from. And so that's why it's so profound. We're talking about a half-century change here in the voting behavior of a particular group of voters.
And this pattern has a special application in Northern Virginia in the three counties Quentin mentioned, Fairfax, Loudoun, Prince William, because those counties comprise the 10th congressional district where Barbara Comstock, who is as in-your-face a partisan Republican as they come, who's standing for re-election to the House of Representatives for a second term, and is battling the Trump headwind and has been separating herself from Trump for months, long before it was in vogue with Republicans. What I'm wondering about, though, in that particular race, if her problem isn't as much the possibility of a Clinton wave as it is sort of a falling, a dropping Republican tide, that because of her apostasy on Donald Trump, the rural areas of the district that don't have a lot of bodies but have a lot of Republican votes won't be able to deliver for her. And that'll make this a very close and certainly very expensive campaign of all the seats that are in contest in Virginia. That's the one that's generating, here's that word again, national attention.
Right. We have another trend that might be broken this year that's been around for a couple of decades, is we've seen fewer and fewer split ticket voters since, say, the late 1980s. When politics started becoming polarized in '92 with the election of Bill Clinton, voters tended to stop splitting their tickets. They would vote straight ticket Republican, straight ticket Democratic. And independents, people who didn't identify as one or the other, would go in and vote down one ticket or down the other ticket. This may be a reverse year, where we see voters do two different things than they've done in the past. One is drop off the ballot strategically. For example, in the case with the 10th, you may find a Republican Trump supporter go in to vote for Trump and then not vote in the congressional race because they're so upset with Barbara Comstock. And you may see some strategic split ticket voting, people who are going to vote for, say, Clinton, but then strategically think, well, she needs to be checked by Republican Congress, so they vote for a Republican at the congressional level. So we may see the reverse of a trend which has been around for a couple of decades, which is sort of more straight ticket voting. In the last presidential election, for example, only 25 congressional districts went differently at the top of the ballot, presidential, than went at the congressional level. So basically, people are straight ticket voting, and they have been for a couple of decades. We may see the end of that this year.
Not just in Virginia.
Not just in Virginia, but nationally. But
No.
Virginia has, as Jeff said, Virginia has essentially the case study in that in the 10th district this year.
Now, 3 other congressional districts, members of the General Assembly running on either as Republicans or Democrats. Any cliffhangers in those 3, the redrawn 4th, 5th, one down at the beach?
In the 4th, which now includes Richmond, a good chunk of the Richmond area, it would be described, I guess, in the courts as a minority influence, or a minority influence district, excuse me, with a larger African American population. That seems to be solidly Democratic. Donald McEachin, a state senator from Henrico, is likely to win it. And I don't know that anyone can talk about the 4th in its earlier iteration. Randy Forbes was there for a number of years, conservative Republican. Instead of defending that seat, he cut and run, and tried to win the Republican nomination in a redrawn 2nd district anchored by Virginia Beach, was defeated by Scott Taylor, a more Trump-like Republican, for lack of a better description. I I wonder if a guy like Randy Forbes had maybe been a bit more accommodating, a little less doctrinaire over his many years in Congress, if he could have gone into a district, even a redrawn district like the 4th, and made a case for re-election. But our politics doesn't permit that.
Right. And Randy Forbes was rejected resoundingly by Republican primary voters in the 2nd. And I would argue that the primary rejection was over this idea that he would abandon the 4th and try to move over and run in the 2nd. His opponent in the primary, Scott Taylor, essentially said, who is a Navy SEAL, by the way, a retired Navy SEAL, said, look, I never cut and run on my men. You're cutting and running on your district. And it was a very effective, it was death by not 1,000 cuts, by 1 or 2 really deep cuts. And that was one of those cuts. And so I think Randy Forbes would have done himself a lot better if he had said, look, it's a redrawn district, but I'm going to fight for my seat. And if I go down, at least I'll go down fighting. I think he would have had more respect. It would have been principled. It would have been principled. And instead, he ends, who knows what he'll do, but he ends his congressional career at this point in a way that I don't think most people would want to end their congressional careers.
A quitter and a carpetbagger.
What about the 5th that includes Charlottesville and over to Lynchburg and then all the rural areas in between? Is a district that tends to vote Republican? Do you see it staying that way?
It should vote Republican, but Tom Garrett, the Republican nominee, a state senator, has run anything but, shall we say, a clean, systematic campaign. He's had some difficulty with fundraising, but he seems to be, getting up ahead of steam in the closing weeks. That campaign has taken on something of a nasty turn. Dittmar, the Democratic nominee, it was suggested, had been arrested and charged with driving under the influence. It turned out that wasn't the case. And yet this is just the sort of, kind of personal twist that tends to get voters' attention.
It should go without mentioning that in 2008, both the 5th and the 2nd went Democratic on the coattails of a big Democratic turnout for Barack Obama.
A largely and very heavy African-American turnout in both of those districts.
In both of those districts. Democrats must be kicking themselves not having put up a more serious candidate in the 2nd, because if Virginia goes heavily Hillary Clinton this year, there may be coattails that makes the 5th more competitive, not likely, but could be, and certainly may have made the 2nd more competitive, not likely, but could have been.
Let's switch over and talk about rigged elections that's being talked about. Did people on the rolls? What's your take on that as you look particularly in the Commonwealth of Virginia on those matters?
Well, the Republican hierarchy in Virginia, which has clearly had some difficulty with Donald Trump, has nonetheless, separate and apart from Trump, kind of advanced the idea now for some months, that Virginia's electoral system has been cooked. Now, this goes back to April and Governor McAuliffe's executive order re-enfranchising or enfranchising 206,000 felons who had completed their penalties. So this has been kind of a theme in Virginia Republican circles long before Trump kind of gave it national voice. And then there were some developments locally. Harrisonburg, for example, 19 people added to the rolls, all of whom were dead by this enterprising, allegedly by this enterprising young man up there. It turned out that one of them was the late father of a retired circuit court judge. So that immediately got people's attention. But and then, of course, there was that joint hearing of the House and Senate election committees raising questions about the kind of job or the job that's being done on the system by the governor's appointee at the elections department. I think for the most part, we're going to have fairly clean, uneventful elections here. But what all of this has, I think, brought into much sharper focus is how the parties do much better in different types of elections. The Democrats tend to do better when there is a large number of voters. The Republicans tend to do better when there are fewer voters and when those voters' influence is magnified either by gerrymandering or by restrictions on ballot access, photo ID, that sort of thing.
The bottom line is there's a significant amount of academic research on this. There's no evidence of systematic voter fraud. There was a law school professor who analyzed a billion votes over the last 10 years in presidential and congressional elections, and could find something like 26 cases where there may have been somebody who double voted, for example, was registered in one state and 2 states and then voted in both, but couldn't confirm those. Most cases of voter fraud really occur at the registration level, which is not the vote level. And I think that distinction is important to make because it's purposefully confused a lot of times. There are cases around the country where people are registering voters who don't exist or who have died because they're trying to meet a quota. They're getting paid to do this kind of stuff. They're trying to meet a quota. Those instances normally get caught because those voter registration records have to be confirmed before the voters are registered to vote, right? When it comes to actually casting votes, a ballot, there's very little evidence of any kind of fraud. The idea that people are going to vote multiple times, the idea that people vote in different states, it just doesn't happen very often. You're more likely to be struck by lightning twice than you are to find more than 24 cases where you've got actual voter fraud.
And in Virginia, particularly out in the southwestern part of the state where the two-party tradition endured for centuries, there was a contested state senate election in the 40s, and it went to recount, and recounts are judicial proceedings, and both sides can call witnesses. And the story goes that this one fellow with a wooden leg was called, and he said that he'd been promised by one candidate a fresh peg leg if he cast his ballot for him, and the other candidate would give him a pint of whiskey. He ended up with both, and it was never determined for whom he voted.
Right. Yes. Before our time would be up, something that I haven't asked you about in the elections, we've got a couple of minutes. What else would you want to tell us?
Well, Virginia has an election every year, and clearly the presidential election is a kind of an introduction to the main event, the gubernatorial election. And I recognize that every election has a different electorate, but I can't help but wonder what aftershocks are there for Republicans in 2017 as they go about selecting their statewide ticket. Trump aftershocks. Are the candidates going to have to explain why they were, to some Republicans, why they were less enthusiastic about Trump as the nomination is sorting out? And then to a general electorate, will these candidates have to explain why they were not more outspoken in their criticism of Trump? I'm wondering if we're going to see a bit more guilt by association, or an attempt at guilt by association in 2017 because of this unusual presidential year.
And again, linking the presidential and the gubernatorial election, if Hillary Clinton wins, it looks like she is right now, Senator Tim Kaine is going to move to the Naval Observatory, and Governor McAuliffe is going to appoint somebody to fill out the remaining few months, or fill out a few months of his term until a special election, which will happen to be the same day as our gubernatorial race. And so for the first time, I think, in the Commonwealth's history, we'll have a gubernatorial race that is not at the top of the ticket. It'll be a special election for the U.S. Senate at the top of the ticket. By all accounts, everybody that I talked to about this, it could be a $50 to $60 million Senate race at the top of the gubernatorial
And I'm
ticket.
getting the word that we'll have to end it there, and we will pick that subject up after the election. But thank you both very much.
Thank you.
This Week in Richmond is made possible in part by Dignity Memorial, caring for our communities with a network of funeral homes and cemeteries in Virginia and throughout North America. More information about Dignity Memorial's providers is online at dignitymemorial.com. The Virginia Chamber of Commerce, the voice of the Virginia business community. For jobs, the economy, and public health, Virginia Hospitals, our lifeline.
The Virginia Education Association, because a good education is good for everybody.
Additional support is provided by these sponsors. And by the members of Virginia's public television stations. Thank you.